Have you ever felt like your jazz solos were meandering? Like they weren't really going anywhere in particular, and maybe you listen back to them and you think, man, that's kind of a boring solo. Like I bored myself because it was just a stream of notes. There wasn't really anything that was particularly exciting about it. There wasn't anything that differentiated any sections from each other. Well, if you ever felt that way, then I have a really special guest on the show today, Jeff Schneider, to talk all about how we can avoid meandering solos, some specific ways we can do that. Let's cue the music.
Welcome to the LJS podcast, where you get weekly jazz tips, interviews, stories, and advice for becoming a better jazz musician. And now your host. He's a jazz musician, author, and entrepreneur, Brent Vaartstra.
All right. Hey, what's up, everybody? Brent here from LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, and videos all geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. Really excited for you to be here because, like I said, our special guest, Jeff Schneider, is going to be teaching us a lot of great things about music today. This is a really, really great episode, and I am just really excited to share it with you. So Jeff, he is a composer, he's a saxophonist, a pianist, and he is a YouTube. He has an awesome YouTube channel, so if you're not familiar with it, make sure you go check him out there, and also check him out at jeffschneidermusic.com. And we talk about several different topics today, but the main one that we really focus on is meandering jazz solos, how to avoid them, how to make our jazz lines sound more like they make sense together, sound more like they're a conversation rather than just an endless stream of notes. So this is a great show. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast if you're not already on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We got a lot of great guests coming up. I know you're going to dig this. But without further ado, let's just jump right into this talk with Jeff Schneider. All right, we're welcoming back on the show my friend Jeff Schneider, who's a saxophonist, he's a composer, he's a piano player, he's one of my favorite jazz YouTubers out there. So Jeff, thanks for being back on, man.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So we had you back on in episode 65. I knew we had to have you back on again because that was an excellent episode, of course, expected nothing less. And so you're here to just drop the value bombs again on the audience. So really excited to have you do that today. That sounded so violent. That's okay.
That's jazz, okay. It's a violent activity.
I didn't mean it in a violent way. Anyways, but let's just start. For those who don't know Jeff, and Jeff is like, oh man, he's like, in my opinion, one of the awesomest, I guess in the jazz general music arena on YouTube. I mean, he's like one of the greatest guys out there. So, but outside of that, like if you don't know him, you would probably want to know more about what Jeff's all about. So Jeff, go ahead and let us know what you do, what you're all about.
Yeah, so I kind of put myself in the musician bucket. I play saxophone, piano, do a lot of composing. I was trained in the jazz tradition, but nowadays I'm making all kinds of music. I started composing for film and advertising about 5-6 years ago, so that kind of put me in different genres. But, my heart is definitely in the jazz tradition and improvisation. And that's also what I like to teach. I teach a lot of people how to improvise, how to compose, and it's what I love to do.
Yeah, and YouTube is like where most of your content lives, although like you do have a website, jeffschneidermusic.com, and you have a newsletter, all that great stuff. But what kind of like give an example of like some stuff that you would find going to Jeff Schneider's YouTube channel?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel has evolved a little bit over the past few years, but there's certainly a lot of content there teaching people how to improvise, and there's a lot of music theory on there, how to analyze music and use that analysis to help you with your improvising and composing. I do a lot of harmonic analysis, so analyzing chord progressions and creating chord progressions. As you mentioned, I also play piano, so I do some piano tutorials. So it's sort of that advanced harmony, those chords that I like to call the stanky sick chords.
Yeah.
The stanky loops and the sick chords, just to be clear.
You have the best name for your products, by the way.
Yeah. So it's sort of, it's just those chords and those lines that kind of make everybody go, woo. And
right.
That's what I love to get after and help people, get their audiences to make those same sounds.
I love that so much. That's awesome. So you're a professional musician. You are a YouTuber, but how did you I always ask this question, and even if we talk about this, a lot of episodes ago, it's like over a year ago we had you on the show.
Yeah.
But, regardless if anybody knows this already, what got you started in jazz or interested in jazz in general?
Well, I started in music just messing around on the piano, trying to play songs by ear. And back then I was just working with very simple triads, like 1 chords, 4 chords, 5 chords, and basically trying to play any song that I heard, usually like a movie theme or something like that, and figure it out on the piano. And then eventually I was like, there are some other sounds out there that I don't know how to play. And as soon as I learned how to play like a major 7th chord, my mind just was blown. And then from there, I just kept trying to figure out, okay, I can add this note to that chord, and I can add that chord to this progression, and suddenly it's getting more and more colorful. And that's kind of how I developed into loving jazz, because of course there's so many harmonic and melodic and rhythmic colors in jazz, and that music just really resonated with me. And here we are today. I'm I guess you could call me a professional jazz musician.
You are a professional jazz musician, Jeff. Don't you ever doubt that for 1 second. So yeah, that's interesting. It's always interesting how people got interested in jazz, and I feel with musicians, it's always similar to your story. Here's these chords, here's this harmony, and jazz just obviously has a lot of colors to it. Just so it's that natural curiosity with all of that stuff. And I always do preach to people that aren't necessarily wanting to become jazz musicians, or that maybe love other styles of music, but that if you spend a little time in jazz, you can definitely learn a ton about music in general from studying jazz repertoire and jazz harmony and stuff like that. Would you say that's true?
Oh, yeah. And even in jazz, it's I use that term so loosely because even within that genre of jazz, there's so many different pockets of styles, and even Charlie Parker didn't like to use the word jazz because it put him in a box.
Whoa.
So yeah, but absolutely.
Didn't know that.
Oh yeah, it's a great. I think I can't remember the exact story, but it's worth looking into. It's how he did not like that term very much. But certainly jazz has popped up in modern music that we hear on the radio today. Certainly in R&B music. So it's integrated into so many other styles, and that's why I love it, because it's really, I was talking before about composing in different genres. The reason I'm able to do that is because I have that jazz background, and because you can apply those skills to so many different genres. Whereas if I were just a strictly classical musician, then I don't think I would have that same bag of tools to use in these other genres that I'm asked to work in.
Yeah, for sure. And I know for a fact that you just, because we were hanging out the other week, that you were telling me that you finished up this documentary that you've been working on, composing for a documentary. So it's skills like that have even opened up doors for you to have that kind of a career too, which is John
Williams is actually a jazz pianist. He's a jazz pianist. Yeah, that's his background. Jazz.
I would have thought that he was had a classical background for some reason. Well, I'm sure he did too. But
there's a lot of film composers are closet jazz musicians. Musicians. That's kind of how they got started, at least.
Right. That's so interesting. Awesome. All right. So Jeff, listen, I got a listener. Well, not really a listener. It was someone in our Facebook group asked a question. I'm wondering if you could help me answer it today.
I'd be happy to. At least I'd be happy to try.
All right, awesome. So the question was, how do I play a jazz solo that doesn't sound the same the whole time, just a bunch of notes from beginning to end? How do you develop the jazz solo?
Yeah, that's a big question. But I think the word in there that's kind of interesting that was used was, if it sounds the same the whole time. I think that, well, first of all, that's kind of objective, or subjective rather, where, as is the word good, what's a good jazz solo to you? What's good to somebody else? But what I'm thinking when I hear that is, if something sounds the same the whole time, it's kind of like the listener is tuning out. There's nothing for them to latch on to. There's nothing for them to be interested in.
Right.
And I think the main reason for that is because you get this sort of meandering quality to your improvisation where it's just kind of like noodling. I could compare it to like run-on sentences that don't really have anything to do with one another. The language analogy is so helpful in this regard, because if you talk to somebody, there's like some crazy person on the street and they're just mumbling to themselves. You hear words, you hear sentences sometimes, but
we're both from New York City. That's why you use that. That's why you use that. That
exactly.
example.
I guess, yeah. Here in New York City, you get a lot of people who are just kind of talking to themselves and not making a whole lot of sense. And the reason for that is because the ideas aren't connected in any way. They're not building on anything. It's just, like I said, it's sort of this meandering quality to what they're saying. And it's really easy to do that with improvising, because we learn all of these different techniques and licks and harmonic strategies and tricks that sometimes we get way too complicated, and the real solution is just to simplify. I think that's at least a start to answering that question. How does that sound so far?
Yeah, so far it sounds great. And I think when I was reading the question, like what I was reading into it is along the lines of what you're saying, and also something that I can. Like I can relate to. Like I can remember, especially having trouble with that, is you start to improvise and immediately out of the gate, it's just like, all right, I got to start playing ideas and I got to keep the ideas flowing. And, there's really no arc or storyline, or there's nothing to the solo other than it's just, I'm playing a bunch of stuff, right? Like, I think that's what I was getting out of it. And I think really what this person was asking is how to not sound like a crazy person walking around New York City. So yeah. I think you're on track.
Well, the word story is something that, at least in my jazz education experience, when I was coming up, I heard a lot of people talk about, you got to tell a story with your solo. And that's kind of some esoteric language there. And I kind of know what that means. And but at the time when I was hearing teachers talk about creating a story, I wasn't always sure exactly how to do that. So what I've been telling a lot of my students lately is to really focus on repeating yourself to create some momentum and to develop ideas. Sometimes this is referred to as motivic development, but I like to just use the word repetition because it's sort of a very simple way of understanding this approach. And if you take a look at melodies, that's a great way you can learn so much from good melodies about how to develop an idea and how to repeat yourself musically. There's a lot of melodies that literally are just repetition. C-jam blues,
Yeah.
And that happens again and again and again. Or what's that tune called? Sunny Moon for Two. How does it go? So you get that line over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's literally the same exact thing again and again. And there's no reason why you can't do the same thing in a solo. So if you're playing over a blues or something, and the blues is a great way to get started with getting comfortable repeating yourself, because you could, take the blues scale if you wanted and just play the same line again and again. And then you start to develop an idea and it's not so random anymore. So it's kind of counterintuitive, the answer here, because the question was, how do you keep from everything, just sounding the same? And what I'm saying is, well, you actually have to play the same. You have to repeat yourself. So
yeah,
the best way to get started with this, I think, is to play something and then play it again. Because once you start doing that, you're developing a pattern. And people love patterns. That's how we remember things. That's how we understand things. If you don't have any pattern for people to latch onto, then they're going to tune out, right? There needs to be some level of expectation there. And without the pattern, you don't have any expectation.
Absolutely. I actually think that, and I guess another term that sometimes we use for what you're saying is motivic development. But I think you said it way better than just using some term. Like it's about creating the expectation that, you've heard something and something more is going to happen with it. Not just, here's an idea, let's move on to another idea, and then another idea, and then another idea, right? And they may not even have anything to do with each other. So yeah, and a lot of music, I'm thinking about Miles Davis is someone who really does that a lot. It's just simply taking one idea and riffing off of it and moving forward with it, creating this arc to it. It was an episode,
145, where we walk through how to listen to a jazz recording. And I think we were listening to Someday My Prince Will Come off we were listening to just a few solos off of it. And Hank Mobley does the same thing on that solo. He really like takes some lines and phrases and just keeps working them over and over and over again and adding to them, sometimes subtracting from them. So yeah, I'm loving this. I mean, this is...
Yeah.
So how do we... All right, so like we know the what, right? So like obviously like we can start, repeating ourselves. But what does that look like? Like how do we do that? How do we apply that?
Yeah, the first and easiest way is to, like I said, just repeat yourself exactly whatever you played previously, just play it again. And again, this works really well with the blues. So if you played like 1, 2, 3, 4. And although that's super simple, it's a great way to start a solo because you're, again, developing that pattern and it gives the listener something to latch onto. And once you're comfortable with that, where you're repeating the same exact thing, then you can start to drill down a little bit and look for individual elements of a line that you could repeat. So, for instance, there's the rhythm. You could repeat the rhythm. There's the shape of the line. You could repeat the shape of the line. You could repeat the exact pitches and change the rhythm or change the shape. So, for example, we'll go back to that line I played. Let's do the same thing, but now we'll change the pitches. So the rhythm will be the same, but we'll do...
Yes.
Now we have a phrase A and a phrase B, and they're sort of communicating with one another. The reason that they're able to have that sort of conversational quality is because they share something, and there's such subtle variation that you still have that essence of repetition there. I'll play it one more time. So
yeah, definitely. What happens when you take that exact same phrase you just played and apply it over the 4 chord now?
That's a great question. So when I teach people, I teach a couple of different methods for bringing your ideas onto other chords. Now, this particular line, I don't actually have to change any of the notes. I could play the same exact lick, and it's still going to work on the 4 chord. So I'll play it with the chords underneath. So here's with the 1 chord. Now, if I played it with the 4 chord, it would sound like this. I'll play it up here. So it sounds good on the 4 chord too. But what you can also do is you can change the notes to fit the 4 chord in the same way that they fit the 1 chord. So originally I played 1 1 1 3 1 3 4 3 1. That's on the 1 chord. Now if I do that same formula, we'll call it, I'll play it on the 4 chord now. So that's some like direct transposition there. So there's different ways of moving an idea from 1 chord to the next. Let's do one more example that's going to give us a little bit more of a challenge as we go to the 4 chord. So let's say I have this line. Let's do this. Here it is again. Now, if I play the 4 chord underneath that, it's going to sound like this.
Right, got some dissonance there.
It's not sounding so good. And the reason for that is because we didn't adjust the notes to fit the new chord. I'm playing on a B flat 7 here at the beginning for my 1 chord. That's a D. And then when I go to the 4 chord, E flat 7, D is not going to fit over that chord so well because an E flat 7, of course, has a D flat in it. So what you can do is just make the subtle change to turn that D into a D flat, and now we have this line that's going to sit very well over the E flat 7 chord.
Right. So adjusting the line to the quality of the chord, which is obviously why, I mean, the fundamentals of just understanding, what makes a different quality of a chord, a different quality of a chord. Because, like, I mean, you could do, for example, like you could play, like, let's just say it wasn't a blues and you were just playing a major 7th chord, and then you turned that, like, let's just say it was a major 4 chord, and then you turn it into a minor 4 chord. You can take the same line and just adjust it to reflect that now it's a minor idea. So
So if you had That's over E flat 7. If we did E flat minor 7,
love it.
It's just a subtle change. Obviously, it fits the harmony, but there's so much similarity from what we played previously that we're playing ideas that are connected. And I think the biggest problem that people get into is that they make changes that are not subtle enough. So they feel like, oh, I just played that. People aren't going to want to hear that again. Or this sounds too similar to what I played previously. People aren't going to want to hear that again. And that's exactly the wrong thing to be thinking about. You want to make those variations subtle. I like to compare it to that old game, Telephone. If you remember when you whisper something into somebody's ear and then they whisper the same thing into the next person's ear, and you get this gradual evolution of a line, and the changes are super, super subtle. But over time, it does evolve. So the biggest piece of advice I can give in this subject is to repeat yourself, but make variations every so often, but do so subtly. Don't change anything too drastically, or else you'll lose that original idea, and then you'll lose that pattern, and you'll lose the listener. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, everything you just said right there was like, I don't mean to sound redundant, but that was like gold right there for just like exactly what makes a good solo. And I keep going back to what you first originally said, which was establishing that pattern, that expectation for the listener. I mean, that's really when the best, like even pop songs. So if we think about like some of the top 40s like pop songs that exist, the ones that you hear and maybe you even claim you don't like them, but you still sing them in your head, the reason that they're so, it's because they're catchy, because they're setting up these patterns of expectation. And so that doesn't, you can do the same thing in your jazz solos too. So let's really quickly, cause we talked about basically several techniques here to use. Again, we'll use the term motivic development just for the sake of understanding the concept. So you first talked about just taking an idea and then the next time around just making a slight variation on it slightly, right? You started with that blues lick. Do you remember that blues lick you first played?
Something like, no, I don't remember it. It was something like that though.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
And then you added this extra ornament at the end of the second time you played it,
Right.
Yeah. And just that little extra note that you played at the end, it just like immediately like my ears like lit up. And I was like, whoa, Jeff Schneider is like the most genius, jazz improviser in the world. And all you did was you added another note, right?
But I think we got to dig into that a little bit because it's not just that I added the note. What happened with that second phrase is that I started the line the same way, which is the repetition part. That's building the pattern and building the expectation. Now, the reason that last note sounds so great, and the reason why you said your ears lit up, which is the exact way that I describe that experience, is that we've broken the pattern once we go to that higher note.
You broke the pattern.
We broke the pattern. We go against the expectation, and that is the experience where people's ears light up. So when I start the second phrase like this, up until then it's the same thing. But then when I go to that higher note, that's the change. That's the note that breaks the pattern. That's what defies the expectation. That's what catches people's attention. Now, the real nugget here is that we can't break an expectation unless we have one in the first place. And the only way you're going to have an expectation is if you create that pattern. So you need to repeat yourself at first in order to set up an expectation if you are ever going to want to get that light up experience with somebody's ears and break that pattern.
Dude, this is like jazz psychology right here, man. You're laying down. I didn't know you had a degree in jazz psychology. This is awesome.
Well, I talk and think about it a lot, so I at least have some ideas.
Yeah, it's almost like you teach music for a living or something
like that. Yeah,
dude, awesome. So yeah, wow. The way you put that is perfect. So you have that right there. So let's categorize that as you have your idea and you set up a pattern and then you break the expectation, right? Like not complete. Like I mean, you start setting it up like it's like but then you add that little thing at the end. It's like that was not what I was expecting to happen, right? So it's the combination of adding that together. So then we also talked about just simply taking the same idea and applying it over a different chord that's coming up in a chord progression, right? So for just sake of organizing our thoughts here, that would, like, let's say that's number 2, right? So you can, transpose that exact same idea. And then then we talked about, go for it.
I was just going to say there's sort of 2 ways that you can do that. One where you directly transpose something. Let's say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on one chord, then you can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the next chord. And then there's also that more, I think it's kind of like voice leading almost, where you change the notes in the line, only the notes that need to be changed to fit the new chord. So that's another way of continuing the idea. So I guess
that was the one I was going to go to for number 3, for category. Like, so it's like you got the number 1 is like the, you set up a pattern, you break the expectation a little bit. Number 2 is transposing that same idea to another chord, and the same note. Does that make sense? Right. So like not the same notes, but just transposing the entire idea. And then the third variation on that is only changing the notes in the original idea to fit the new chord. Like, if we're changing from a major 7th chord or a dominant 7th chord to a minor 7th chord, we got to add the flat 3, right? Or if it's a major 7 to a minor 7, we got to change that 7, right, to a flat 7, right? So whatever notes you need to change in it. So, man, that's awesome. So another thing that, I think I would add to the original question, which again was, how do I play a jazz solo that doesn't sound the same the whole time, just a bunch of notes from beginning to end? So developing a jazz solo, essentially. Another thing I would just say is, like, people think about licks too much. And so, like, jazz educators, including myself, like to teach like licks and ideas. And the purpose of licks and stuff like that is not so that you play them verbatim. It's so that you can learn some language over top of an idea and start to understand how that works. And then hopefully, after you've gotten these ideas, you can start to develop your own vocabulary. So, if I'm learning a new language, my wife's Greek. So, if I want to learn something in Greek, like, I have to hear a new sentence that probably has a few new words in it. And I have to learn that sentence verbatim before I can actually start trying to make my own variation of that. Right. So I think it goes the same with licks. And a lot of, like, I think especially beginners really struggle with this, is they're learning licks and all this stuff. And then, it's almost their turn for the solo. And then all of a sudden it's their turn to take a solo, and they already have this lick planned in their head. And so they're trying to regurgitate licks, and maybe there's a little bit of anxiety of, like, I just need to get everything I know out there. Those are things that you also want to avoid, along with what Jeff's saying.
Yeah, for sure. There's that real common situation where people find themselves just playing everything they know in the first chorus, and then they have nothing left to play after that. So what I like to recommend is, like you said, learning licks is valuable and you can learn a lot from them. But when it comes time to improvise, I like to suggest people just come up with new melodies for the song. That's a nice way of conceptualizing it, because then you're not thinking about, what lick is going to work here, what lick is going to work there. You're more connected to the actual music and what you're hearing in your head. And again, when you are thinking about improvising a melody, then you're naturally going to be leaning more towards this sort of repetition approach that we've been talking about today.
100%. So I think it was, episode 142 had one of my 30 Steps to Better Jazz playing students for a coaching call that we did. And he was struggling with this idea of, playing by the quote unquote rules, like playing the guide tones, playing the chord tones, playing the licks over top of these chord progressions. And we did this cool exercise. I think everybody could check this out, after you're listening to this one, if you'd like, where we simply just create melodies. We just practice taking a chord progression and saying, all right, let's just 4 notes per chord, and just find as many variations as you can to connect those chords together. And, so this is the anti-lick playing. This is like the composing method. So slowing things down, the practice room being like the laboratory, right? We can slow things down, we can splice it up, and just taking a step back for a second and trying to compose. And that's exactly what you're talking about right now.
Yeah. And the way I think about improvisation is just spontaneous composition. I don't really like to distinguish between those two. You're just writing music on the spot. And if you start to think about improvising as this thing that's separate from composing, separate from making real music, then you run into that meandering quality where you're just kind of noodling around. And I think, people have a natural, music lovers have a natural sense of what makes a good melody. Like you were talking about pop songs earlier. A lot of these singer-songwriters might not know that much about music theory. Maybe they only know how to play 4 chords on a guitar, but their melodies naturally follow these sort of patterns that we've been talking about, and they're not even thinking about it. And my point is that we have this ability to create melodies, but we learn so many techniques, we learn so much about music theory and improvising this way and that way, that we forget we have that ability to just play melodies and make them up and use our ears. Like, that's where it's at. And once you feel comfortable in that space, then you can start to expand and experiment with some different things. But in terms of priority, you got to have that melody established, whether it's improvised or not. And I'll also say that when it comes to, you were talking about Miles Davis before, and listening to music and hearing how other improvisers are doing this, I can't recommend that enough. Listen to other people improvising, listen to other melodies and how other melodies develop their ideas and how improvisers develop their ideas. And you'll find that some improvisers do it really blatantly, like maybe a Miles Davis or a Hank Mobley. You'll really be able to hear how clearly they are developing and repeating their ideas. But there are going to be some improvisers who it's not so clear, and it's almost like it's a little bit disguised. That doesn't mean they're doing it. It just means it's a little bit more buried in their playing. But here's the kicker. Those great improvisers that you don't hear it so well, I guarantee that they're able, if they wanted to, they could throw down and have a solo that is really well developed. So they're choosing maybe not to make it so obvious how they're developing their idea. It's a little bit more disguised. But if they wanted to, they could. I'm thinking about like more modern jazz improvisers who, like a Mark Turner or somebody who's playing really complex angular lines, intervallic lines that you're not always going to hear, like, that kind of a thing. But Mark Turner can definitely develop an idea like that if you wanted to. My point being, if you don't want your solos to sound so predictable, if that's sort of the negative spin on it that you're coming away with here, that's fine. But you need to be able to do it and then intentionally not do it, rather than your default being that you just kind of end up meandering around and you don't have any other way of doing it. I don't think that's not a good place to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything gold there. And by the way, that lick that Jeff keeps playing, he copyrighted that. That's proprietary. So don't play that in any clubs. Like ASCAP's going to come in, get you. So
watch out.
Watch out. So yeah, me and Jeff, we get together sometimes. We both live in New York, hang out a little bit, talk about what we do with our online education stuff. And you were telling me the other day, whatever it was, that you're creating some cool courses for your folks over there at Jeff Schneider Music. Interested to hear what's going on in that realm.
Yes. So I recently reached out to my audience, just trying to get a read on what people are really looking to learn more about, because I have lots of ideas, but of course I want to be focusing on what people are most interested in. And it seems like people really want to learn more about making the changes, how to play over chord changes, which is something, as I said, I've talked a lot about. And so I've already started developing this new course called Making the Changes, and it's going to be all about playing through chord changes, how to improvise over simple chord progressions, complex chord progressions, and how to do so musically. So you're not just sort of like rambling through, like we've been sort of talking about today, on how to get away from that. So in that course, I'm going to be getting into more detail about a lot of the stuff I've talked about today. And I think it's going to be a super valuable resource for people who just want their solos to, kind of go beyond just that sort of musical gibberish that we're trying to avoid here, and really be able to have their lines reflect the chord changes in a really musical way that, of course, makes their audience go, woo!
Yeah, right. So, yeah, that's awesome. And I love that you are all about creating, great, free content, obviously, and courses and resources. Like, just to better serve your audience, because, you know, you and me both have a great privilege to have a bunch of like basically online music students. You know, we get to just share. So, I mean, I think that's awesome that you're creating a course that, you know, specifically what your following wants, what your audience wants. So that's super cool. And, you know, obviously Jeff does not need my endorsement by any means, but if you're not locked into what Jeff is doing at his YouTube channel, at what he's doing at jeffschneidermusic.com, I highly suggest that you do get involved, because as you heard from today's episode, I was about to say value bombs again, and then I was like, wait, let's avoid this. Value nuggets, whatever. Anyways.
Well, the name of my newsletter is called Musical Truth Nuggets. So
Musical Truth, yes, that's right. Which is an awesome newsletter. So how can people get signed up for that newsletter and also just find out about your course when it eventually comes out?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is by going to my website, jeffschneidermusic.com, and on that homepage there is a little form to fill out with your email address, and then you'll get the newsletter. And as you said, you'll get notified about when that Making the Changes course is coming out, which will be soon.
Awesome. And we'll have Jeff's website also linked up in the show notes today, learnjazzstandards.com/episode 154. And that way you can also link to it there, get involved with what Jeff's doing. Jeff, man, I don't want to say, like, I had high expectations for this episode. Like, I really did. Like, I felt in my heart that this was going to be good. Well, I just wasn't expecting it to be this good. I mean, and I mean that in like a good way. So thanks for being on the show.
That's good to hear.
Glad to have you, and we're definitely going to have you back on in the future.
Looking forward. Always happy to be here, Brent. Thanks so much.
Oh, yeah, Jeff Schneider, thanks for doing that, man. That was a great show. And that's all we have for today. Again, appreciate Jeff just for, really laying it down today, just really giving a lot of his knowledge to all of you. I really appreciate him for doing that. I know that you got a lot out of the show today. Make sure you check out jeffschneidermusic.com to get connected with him and everything that he is doing. All right, like I always say, hey, if you enjoyed this show today, make sure you rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. Really helps other people know that it is a show worth listening to. And we're going to have a lot of more really great guests coming up on the show. I'm really excited about it. And, man, this year is really going to be a year that we're just going to have so many great interviews. This is going to be a great year for the podcast. Not only do I know it because I planned this podcast, but I can just feel it. I can just totally feel it. I'm going to be just getting on people that, are just brilliant. So I'm excited about that. So make sure you're subscribed, and hey, I'll look forward to seeing you back in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the LJS podcast, brought to you by LearnJazzStandards.com. Subscribe to the series on iTunes, and don't forget to join our jazz community at LearnJazzStandards.com/newsletter.